In the spring of 1900, a sponge diver dropped into 60 meters of black Mediterranean water off a barren rock called Antikythera, and what he found down there would end up rewriting the history of human intelligence. He came up screaming about a pile of dead bodies on the seafloor. His captain thought the nitrogen had scrambled his brain, so he went down himself. What they found wasn't bodies. It was bronze. Arms, torsos, horses, a hand reaching out of the silt, an entire shipment of looted Greek art that had been sitting untouched at the bottom of the sea for 19 centuries. That wreck became one of the first major underwater excavations in history, and it filled museum halls with masterpieces. But buried in a crate of unremarkable, corroded lumps was a fist-sized chunk of green bronze that nobody looked at twice. It sat in a drawer for the better part of a year. And then it cracked open. And inside, where everyone expected nothing but rock and rot, someone saw a gear wheel. A precise, deliberately cut gear wheel with teeth so fine they looked machined, sitting inside an object pulled from a ship that sank around 60 BC. That's the moment the Antikythera Mechanism began its long, slow journey from forgotten scrap metal to the single most studied object in the history of ancient technology. Here's what makes this story different from most ancient mystery content you've probably seen. Nothing about the Antikythera Mechanism needs to be exaggerated to be extraordinary. The real, documented, peer-reviewed history of this object is already stranger and more impressive than most of what gets invented about it online. So that's the story I want to tell you today. Not a fabricated headline about a machine that mysteriously reveals a secret prophecy, but the actual decades-long detective story of how real scientists, using real tools, slowly forced a corroded lump of bronze to give up secrets it had been hiding since before the Roman Empire existed. For the first 50 years after its discovery, almost nobody knew what to make of the mechanism. It looked like a mass of fused gears and plates, so encrusted with marine growth and corrosion that even trained conservators struggled to tell where one fragment ended and another began. It sat mostly ignored in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens while researchers focused on the more obviously spectacular finds from the same wreck: the bronze statues, the glassware, the jewelry. A geared bronze lump didn't photograph well next to a life-sized bronze warrior. The person who changed that was a British physicist and historian of science named Derek de Solla Price. Starting in the 1950s and continuing into the 1970s, Price became obsessed with the object. He worked from gypsum casts, from early X-ray images taken by a Greek radiologist, and from the fragments themselves, painstakingly counting teeth on every gear he could identify. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because gear ratios aren't just mechanical curiosities. They're frozen equations. If a wheel with 38 teeth drives a wheel with 127 teeth, that ratio corresponds to a specific astronomical relationship, and if you know your ancient astronomy, you can work backward from the ratio to the celestial cycle it was built to track. Price found evidence of the sun and the moon's motion encoded in the gearing. In 1974, he published his findings in a paper that essentially established the field. For a generation afterward, this was the accepted story. A Greek astronomical calculator, roughly the size of a large book, built sometime in the 1st or 2nd century BC, that modeled the movement of the sun and moon through the zodiac and tracked the calendar. But Price was working from maybe a third of the surviving fragments and incomplete imaging, and he knew it. He got several details wrong, which later researchers would go on to correct, not because he was careless, but because the technology to actually see inside the corroded bronze simply didn't exist yet. That's the pattern that defines the entire history of this object. Every leap forward in imaging technology has forced a correction to what came before it. The next leap came from a British mechanical engineer named Michael Wright, who spent years building physical working models of the mechanism based on his own examination of the fragments, using linear X-ray and later, in the early 2000s, some of the first fully 3D radiographic imaging of the gear stacks. Wright identified that the mechanism likely modeled the 5 planets known in antiquity: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, in addition to the Sun and Moon, using an ingenious system of concentric output shafts and epicyclic gearing, meaning gears that ride on other gears to reproduce the way planets appear to speed up, slow down, and even briefly reverse direction in the sky. a phenomenon called retrograde motion. Wright's reconstructions were controversial at the time. Colleagues disputed how much of the planetary gearing he could really claim to have identified from such fragmentary and corroded evidence, but his physical models proved something crucial. Gearing complex enough to reproduce planetary retrograde motion was mechanically possible using only the materials and tools available in the ancient Mediterranean. That single fact quietly detonated a long-standing assumption in the history of science, which was that this kind of complex gear train wasn't developed until medieval Islamic and European clockwork, more than 1,000 years later. The real turning point, though, the one that actually deserves the word breakthrough, came in 2005. A research consortium called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, a genuine, named, verifiable collaboration between the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, Cardiff University, and other institutions, brought in equipment that had never before been pointed at an archaeological object of this kind. One piece was an 8-ton microfocus X-ray computed tomography scanner, built by a company called X-Tech Systems, so large it had to be shipped to Athens rather than the fragments shipped to it. It could image the interior of the bronze in cross-sectional slices with extraordinary resolution, effectively giving researchers a three-dimensional map of gears, shafts, and mounting points that had been sealed inside the corrosion for 2,000 years and were completely invisible to the naked eye or to conventional X-rays. The second piece of equipment used a technique called polynomial texture mapping, developed by Hewlett-Packard researchers, which uses multiple raking light sources photographed from different angles to bring out surface detail on worn or corroded metal, essentially letting researchers read engraved text that was there the entire time but had become too shallow and too obscured by corrosion to be legible to a human eye under ordinary lighting. What that combination of tools revealed changed the scale of the object entirely. The CT scans found roughly 2,000 characters of ancient Greek text engraved across the mechanism's plates, inscriptions so small that some of the letters are only about 1.5 millimeters tall. This was, in effect, an instruction manual engraved directly onto the machine, describing what its dials and pointers showed. The research team, led by scientists including Tony Freeth, Mike Edmonds, and later Alexander Jones, published their findings in Nature in 2006, and it was a genuinely major moment in the history of archaeological science. The inscriptions confirmed and extended what Price and Wright had proposed. The front dial displayed the position of the sun and moon against the zodiac and against the Egyptian 365-day calendar. A rotating ball, half polished and half blackened, showed the phase of the moon, and the back of the mechanism carried 2 large spiral dials. One tracked the 235-month metonic cycle, a 19-year period after which the phases of the moon realign with the solar calendar, along with the 4-year cycle of Panhellenic Games, including the Olympics. The other spiral tracked eclipses, based on the 223-month Saros cycle known to Babylonian astronomers, complete with glyphs marking which specific months an eclipse was predicted and even, in some cases, notations about the expected time of day. That alone would already make the Antikythera Mechanism the most sophisticated known machine from the ancient world by a wide margin. But the story didn't stop there, and this is where the genuinely recent research comes in, research from the last several years, published in real journals by real named scientists that you can go read yourself. In 2021, a team at University College London, led by Tony Freeth alongside mechanical engineers, published a paper in Scientific Reports that tackled a problem which had frustrated researchers for over a century. The front dial's display of the 5 planets was almost entirely missing. Only a small number of gear fragments and a handful of tantalizing inscriptions survived to hint at what had once been there. Freeth's team didn't use anything resembling the fictionalized AI reconstruction you might have seen described elsewhere. What they actually did was more rigorous, and honestly more impressive precisely because of that rigor. They took the surviving evidence, gear tooth counts, the diameters of surviving gear fragments, the spacing of mounting holes on the plates, and the astronomical periods recorded in the inscriptions describing planetary cycles that the Babylonians and Greeks had already calculated with remarkable precision, and used a mathematical technique adapted from a method usually applied to statistical analysis in modern engineering to work out the minimum number of gears and the specific tooth counts that could physically fit inside the case, while reproducing those known astronomical periods. It's essentially a giant constraint satisfaction problem. Given everything we can measure and everything the inscriptions tell us, what is the smallest, most efficient, physically possible gear train that would produce the correct answer for the position of the Sun, Moon, and each of the 5 visible planets over time? Their proposed solution involved concentric shafts, each carrying pointers for one planet, driven through elegant epicyclic gearing to reproduce not just the average motion of each planet, but the pattern of speeding up, slowing down, and reversing that makes planetary motion so difficult to model. They then built a physical, working proof-of-concept model using this gearing to demonstrate it could actually function inside the size constraints of the surviving case fragments. That research is real. It is contested. Plenty of other historians of ancient technology have pushed back on specific details, and Freeth's team themselves have been careful to describe their planetary gearing as the best current hypothesis rather than a certainty, because the direct physical evidence for that part of the machine is genuinely thin. But it represents exactly the kind of careful, transparent, mathematically explicit reconstruction work that has always driven progress on this object, going back to Price counting teeth by hand in the 1950s. No mysterious black box AI. No secret revelation nobody was supposed to talk about. Just published papers, named authors, physical models you can build and test, and a research community that argues about the details in the open in journals at conferences, the way science is actually supposed to work. There's another thread of very recent, very real research worth knowing about, involving the back cover of the mechanism. A small group of independent researchers has spent years re-examining what's called the back cover inscription, a long block of engraved Greek text on what would have been the rear panel of the case, describing, in something close to a user's manual, how to read the various dials. Much of this text was badly damaged even at the time of discovery, and different research teams have proposed different reconstructions of the missing words based on the surviving letter fragments, grammar, and known Greek astronomical vocabulary of the period. This is genuinely painstaking philological work, closer to restoring a damaged ancient manuscript than to engineering, and it has slowly filled in more of what the machine's original documentation said about its own eclipse predictions, including apparent references to the color and character of predicted eclipses, tied to genuine ancient astronomical traditions around interpreting eclipse omens. Some of that reconstruction remains debated among specialists, and responsible researchers flag exactly which words are confidently read, which are probable, and which are speculative filler. That transparency about uncertainty is, honestly, the most important thing to take away from all of this. So, what does the honest picture actually look like once you strip away the exaggerated headlines? The Antikythera Mechanism was very likely built somewhere between roughly 260 BC, based on the style of the lettering and the ship's cargo, which included coins that helped date the wreck. It was almost certainly not a one-off miracle invented from nothing. The sophistication of the gearing, combined with the sheer specificity of the tooth counts needed to approximate cycles like the Saros and Metonic periods, strongly suggests it sat at the end of a longer tradition of Hellenistic mechanical engineering that we simply don't have other surviving examples of, because bronze was valuable and got melted down and reused constantly in antiquity. Ancient writers, including Cicero, actually describe similar gear devices attributed to the Greek polymath Archimedes and to the astronomer Posidonius of Rhodes, describing planetary models that could be turned by hand, references that historians long treated as possibly exaggerated, until the Antikythera Mechanism surfaced as physical proof that this kind of device really did exist. There's a reasonably strong scholarly case, based partly on the mechanism's astronomical calendar matching Corinthian colonial month names rather than Athenian ones, that it may have originated from a workshop with connections to the island of Rhodes, home to a serious tradition of astronomy in this period, though attributing it to any single named inventor remains speculative, and responsible historians are careful to say so. What we do not have, and what nobody legitimately claims to have, is the missing 2/3 of the mechanism's original gearing recovered as physical, verified fact. What we have instead is decades of increasingly rigorous, increasingly well-evidenced hypothesis built by real-named researchers using real-named techniques, published in real journals you can access today, each one narrowing the range of plausible answers a little further, while being honest about exactly where the evidence runs out and informed inference begins. That is a genuinely more satisfying story than a fabricated one, because it's a story about how knowledge actually gets rebuilt, slowly, arguably, transparently, with real people's names attached to real claims they're willing to defend in public. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with. The Antikythera Mechanism has already survived one of the strangest journeys any object could take. It was built by someone whose name we will probably never know, packed onto a ship, sunk in a storm, buried in silt and darkness for 19 centuries, hauled up by an accident of weather and a sponge diver's curiosity, ignored for decades in a museum drawer, and then slowly, deliberately, forced to reveal itself piece by piece as human tools got sharp enough to see what was always there. Photography found the first gears. Radiography found gears behind the gears. Computed tomography found buried inscriptions no living eye had read in 2,000 years. Careful mathematics and mechanical modeling are now filling in the shape of what's missing, one testable hypothesis at a time. Nothing about that process needed an invented AI moment to be dramatic. It already is. The real machine, the one still sitting behind glass in Athens, doesn't need embellishment to remind you that people 2,000 years ago were doing something with bronze and gears that most of the world wouldn't manage again for well over a millennium, and that we're still, right now, in real time, in the process of understanding exactly how far they got.